So today's topic is a timely one, as many developing countries, particularly small states, face increased vulnerability to large natural disasters and climate change. The costs in human terms are devastating, as are the economic costs. And the macroeconomic costs tend to materialize in lowered GDP per capita and increased sovereign debt levels, both of which affect living standards. The IMF and its partners have recognized the need to help these countries enhance their economic resilience to such events, which are occurring with increasing intensity. Our capacity development collaborations with member countries have focused on preparedness measures in the form of building institutional capacity and crafting policies that can provide fiscal space and financial buffers in anticipation of the challenges ahead. We will hear from our four experts today who have been working specifically on helping to build the resilience in the Caribbean, starting with Sonia Munoz, a Western Hemisphere Division Chief here at the IMF, who will discuss the fund's analytical work on designing the Disaster Resilience Strategy Program. The strategies in that program have been prepared for two pilot countries following the publication of a 2019 IMF board paper that points the way forward for this important work. Sonia?
Thank you, Joe. Good morning, everyone. We are glad to welcome you all to this event. The year 2020 is, of course, dominated by news about COVID-19. Against this backdrop, the fact that 2020 is also a record Atlantic hurricane year somehow slipped under the radar. Our talk will focus on small states, and in particular, the Caribbean, which have already been significantly impacted by COVID shock on tourism and are at the epicenter of increased hurricane activity. Perhaps only due to mere fortune this year, no Caribbean island has been significantly impacted by the hurricane. And while it seems that we could avoid a nightmare COVID plus hurricane scenario, adverse risks from climate events are clearly set to rise further. The question is, can these small states manage such risk? And if so, how? To zoom in on the context, climate-related misfortunes are a true menace for the Caribbean region. They are becoming even more intense compared to other countries. Just a few years ago, Dominica alone was hit by devastating storms twice over a 3-year period. Several other islands, including Anguilla, the Bahamas, Barbuda, and St. Martin, suffered from maximum stress tropical winds just over the past few years. Such hurricanes devastate small states, their lives and livelihoods. They destroy physical capital by damaging infrastructure. They destroy human capital by forcing people to emigrate. They destroy the social fabric by disrupting communities. As a result, they hold back economic growth, development, and social progress. And if this is not enough, beyond the lightning fast blows from hurricanes, there are slower but equally devastating effects of the sea level rise that threatens the jewels of tourist infrastructure by extension, the economic viability of these small island states. However, so far, efforts to prepare for natural disasters have been clearly insufficient. Resources devoted to address natural disasters mostly took the form of ex post, meaning after the disaster hits, emergency assistance, when the catastrophic impact already took a high toll on countries. Only about 14% of disaster-related overseas development is devoted to ex ante, meaning before a disaster hits, resilience. Insurance uptake is also low for both public and private sector, with an average of insurance gap around 66%, reflecting high insurance costs and competing demands on scarce resources. So why more is not done at an early stage? For one, the countries had limited own capacity and resources to devote to early preparedness measures. In turn, donors needed reassurance that the funds will be used by countries in a sustainable way. Underlying these issues was an absence of a comprehensive framework that will guide and coordinate the efforts of the authorities and the various donors. All this created a catch-22 situation, little progress in practice, and evidence of frequent inefficiency that duplication of efforts prevented both the authorities and donors from committing more resources to combating natural disasters and discourage bold ex-ante initiatives. Shifting away from only ex-post assistance to ex-ante preparedness promises to be a game changer. If implemented well, it will greatly mitigate the economic and social dislocations of natural disasters in the first place. Our view is that the benefits of ex-ante resilience are still underrated, since the costs are upfront, while the substantial benefits become visible only over time. More specifically, ex-ante preparedness is a good investment that will pay off in terms of economic growth. Our research, as you can see in the slide, suggests that investing in public capital resilience to natural disasters can increase potential GDP by 3 to 11% in a subsample of Caribbean countries, the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union. The practical solution that we see is designing and implementing a comprehensive country-owned plan of building resilience, a disaster resilience strategy. We call it DRS, that tackles the key problems. As you can see in the slide, the DRS is structured in 3 pillars. Pillar 1, on the left-hand side, structural resilience to reduce fiscal risk, focus on resilient infrastructure, adequate land use, zoning rules, and building codes. Pillar 2, in the middle, financial resilience to reduce the impact of recovery and reconstruction costs on public finances, for instance, through insurance mechanisms. And Pillar 3, on the right-hand side, ex-post and social resilience, focus on effective contingency plans and rapid access to financing for a speedy disaster recovery. Pursuing these policies will, however, involve upfront costs, which most small states cannot afford. Hence, the support of the international community is critical, but countries need to do their part by making concerted efforts with transparent and fiscally sustainable plans and pursuing policies to anchor strong and durable growth. To this effect, the DRS integrates all resilience building activities in a consistent and realistic macro-fiscal framework and identifies critical financing gaps to help catalyze the needed concessional support from the international community, including climate funds. Crucially, the DRS should not follow a cookie-cutter approach and be tailored to country conditions. 2 DRS pilot countries, Grenada and Dominica, for which the DRS are being prepared, showcase the various common issues involved and the difference to be addressed. Estimations for Dominica and Grenada point to a wide range of resilience costs, reflecting countries' different exposures to disasters, their current state of resiliency, development stage, and even topography. For example, Dominica, on the left-hand side of the slide, as we will discuss later, has been recently wiped out of almost all infrastructure, which is to be built from scratch. While Grenada, on the right-hand side, has an acute problem of a sea level rise affecting tourism. Given the COVID shock, both DRS and in the process of incorporating the impact of the pandemic. Thank you. Back to you, Joe.
Thanks, Sonia. To provide a perspective from on the ground, we're now going to turn to Bruce Stacy from the IMF Institute for Capacity Development's Caribbean Regional Technical Assistance Center. Bruce will distill the main lessons and recommendations from the center's public financial management team's hurricane effectiveness reviews for several countries in the Caribbean. These reviews are a recently developed tool to help these countries lay the macroeconomic groundwork in preparation for potential natural disasters such as hurricanes. Bruce?
First off, check whether you can hear me. Okay, good. I apologize to everybody because I had some very big technical difficulties and I've had to sign on with an iPad, which doesn't give me all the access to everything I need. But anyways, first off, I'd like to comment that this project was funded under the Strengthening Disaster Recovery and Resilience in the Caribbean program provided by the UK government. And as a first initiative of this, we decided that given the hurricanes of 2017 and the destruction in the region, we had the opportunity to go in and actually do a post-event assessment of how governments manage their public financial management systems post-hurricane. So we had 4 countries that we looked at: Dominica, Anguilla, Turks and Caicos, and the British Virgin Islands. And if anybody doesn't really know what a Category 5 hurricane is, it's a hurricane above 185 miles an hour. And in the case of the British Virgin Islands, it was above 220 miles an hour. So very significant wind effects. Gwen, I don't know if you can post my pictures there, but no slides. Oh, there we go. So just to give you an understanding of what Rosamond got to deal with the day after the hurricane event happened. This is Rousseau on the left. On the right is the Rousseau River. And I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to visit Dominica. It's beautiful country, tropical rainforest, and that's what's left of a forest after a Category 5 hurricane. Next slide, please. In the British Virgin Islands, the top left-hand picture is the picture of Hurricane Bay, and that was deemed Hurricane Bay because it was supposed to be a protective area where mariners could park their yachts with the idea that it would be protected in a hurricane. You can see in a Category 5, there is no such protection. The interesting thing about BVI was it was hit by 2 Category 5s. It was hit both by Irma and Maria 2 weeks apart. So unbelievable destruction. Up to 85% of infrastructure was damaged. Okay, that's it for the slides. Thank you. So what our review did was we went to each of the countries that were affected, and we spoke with basically all of the management team, especially for the ministries of finance, and found out how they managed to cope with this kind of destruction post-hurricane relief. And what we did was we produced a report that was basically lessons learned for how things worked. So from a budget perspective, it was important that countries had a contingency reserve or actually had some kind of disaster relief fund. And then, of course, it's always important in government to be able to move money from lower priority areas to higher priority areas. And in these cases, these countries were able to do that. Another very important part in 3 of the 4 countries we visited was the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Financing Facility, which is an insurance participation that all countries in the Caribbean have the opportunity to enter into. And as I said, the 3 of the 4 did, and BVI wasn't. Guess what? They now are. But the interesting thing about this was that CRIF pays out exceptionally quickly. So for example, Dominica got the CRIF money that was owed to them from their insurance policy between 10 and 14 days. Very important for recovery. From the other, of course, important thing was emergency relief from donors. And both the overseas territories from the UK and Dominica were amply supplied by their either parent governments or by international organizations. From a revenue perspective, all the countries delayed income tax payments because it wasn't really fair when people are trying to, dig themselves out from under a Category 5 to be worried about tax deadlines. The other thing that was done was that customs duties were suspended, especially on emergency relief. And in some cases, countries had to suspend it for 6 months or more. The interesting thing, however, was that even after those extensions up to 8 months after the event, revenues were increasing up to 20% from duties once those things had been relieved. In budget execution, the number 1 rule we found, so everybody could have a good understanding of what they were spending, was to tag that spending, whether it was setting up systems to do it or to add things to financial systems so they could track their spending. The other thing that was important to be able to do was to rerun their payroll and pensions. So rather than trying to calculate what a weekly or bi-weekly payroll was, they just ran the previous payroll. And then they kept doing that. And then at the end of the system, when things were back online, they were able to go back and fix any mistakes. The interesting thing also, in 2 countries that actually hadn't suffered from 2017 hurricanes, both Barbados and Grenada have implemented what they've added to their loans with private sector companies are hurricane clauses, which we thought was a good idea. So that would defer payments on loans if you were subject to a major hurricane. Of course, importantly was cash management, being able to utilize cash reserves. Another key thing was pre-authorized contracts for cleanup. So contracts had been negotiated before hurricane season, and in the event of a hurricane, people were out doing the job already knowing what their rates were going to be. Emergency purchase orders, and then of course to suspend contract rules over a definitive set period of time so that you wouldn't get caught up in going to multiple tenders and taking 6 months to bring in a contractor. The key thing, how do you function in government, which is almost all now dealt with electronically, when you have no power? So in Dominica's case, I think it took Rosamond 8 months, if I'm correct, to get her power back. So for problems like that, you have to have generators. You have to make sure you have generators in the right places. Generators were being moved around because of insufficient generator supply. So I think most countries got a real lesson in that. The other key thing is backing up your systems, your financial management systems, tax, customs, payroll systems, so that you don't lose all your data. The other interesting thing is that how fast governments reacted to setting up local area networks powered by generators so that clients could come in and use those systems that are so key to the operation of day-to-day government. And in fact, in Dominica's case, they were so successful in customs that they actually had to wean their customers off the systems because they liked the idea so much of being able to actually go down to the customs office and enter their information. The other key feature, of course, in these countries, governments are restricted by numbers of people. So it was important to be conscious of who your key people are and be able to back them up. Because if one of your key systems people is out because he's off island or she's off island or injured, you haven't got the person to back them up. Basically, he's going to tie you up in knots. And then assets, having a good understanding of what the assets of the government are, so you actually know what loss you're suffering. And of course, at the very end, transparency and accountability. So going back to Parliament after you've had all this emergency spending, explaining to Parliament what the spending was on, what the money was moved from, so they'll understand what outcomes will not be achieved, beefing up your internal and external audit systems to cover off understanding what the hurricanes have done. The other important thing to learn from this was that those countries that went through those hurricanes of 2017 were a much better place to deal with the pandemic. They already had a lot of committees set up to help them manage and prioritize funding. They had contracts in place to do important work, expansion of hospitals and healthcare. So it really was, in some senses, a bit of a benefit for those countries that had suffered those hurricanes of 2017. And the other thing I can say just on a personal note was it was just unbelievable to see the dedication and basically fortitude of the public servants in each of these countries, many of whom had to walk 5 kilometers, stepping over trees, cars, rivers, to make it to work. And I think Rosamund can tell you that living in the Ministry of Finance for X number of weeks is not a fun thing. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bruce, for that detailed overview. So Sonia and Bruce have laid out some of the strategies and tools that the IMF have helped develop to increase the resilience in this area. But now we're going to turn to Rosamund Edwards, who Bruce mentioned. She was the former financial secretary of Dominica, is currently an advisor to the IMF executive director to Canada. Rosamund's going to explain the collaborative design process that helped Dominica form its disaster resilience strategy and their experience with the hurricane effectiveness review tools that Bruce had a hand in helping develop. Rosamund?
Thank you, Joe. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll take off from where Bruce has left. And the truth is, Dominica had not anticipated being hit by Hurricane Maria in the way that it did. That being said, government had to move very quickly. And the Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit, announced there and then that Dominica would become the first climate resilient nation. That position was adopted by the entire government and the entire country. And so coming out directly from the hurricane, we first had to look at the immediate recovery and then focus our attention on that long-term resilience goal. I reiterate a couple of things that are necessary day one after an event of that nature. Availability of resources. The need for buffers cannot be overemphasized. Government has to start the ball rolling in terms of rehabilitation. The challenge for Caribbean countries is that the hurricane season is always 6 months away. And so if you utilize all of your resources, question is how quickly can you replenish? That makes the case for more financing for resilience. It also reinforces the need for insurance and support for the CRIF is one of those areas I think we need to promote. Then there has to be an appropriate legal framework. You must be able to spend, but you must be accountable. And so the legal system must be sufficiently flexible, whether it is to grant the exemptions at the customs, to grant the exemptions on tax, to proceed with the award of contracts. The legal system, the legal framework must be sufficiently flexible to allow that, but still maintain accountability. Strong IT support and adequate and competent staff cannot be overlooked. If the building is flooded, the servers are down, you want to bring them back up as quickly as possible. Of course, there are constraints. While the development partners and donors made immediate grants, these grants were really just for cleanup. They had not yet touched the well resilience building and the more detailed recovery. Constraints with capacity, firms, adequate firms to conduct the work that is required, and the adequacy of the facilities. Critically, the adequacy of the air and seaport facilities and the logistics arrangements that are required is something that is probably not taken cognizance of when preparing for hurricanes, but to manage flights coming in with goods, boats coming in with goods, people attempting to go out on damaged facilities takes a lot. And so we have to look more into the medium term and the long term, the nature of our air and seaport facilities so that they can handle the transactions and the traffic in such events. And there's the private sector that very often has to be supported by the government, some with no insurance, some with little insurance, but they must reopen if we have to reestablish business. So then how do we proceed in terms of a more strategic response to disasters and building resilience? Our goal, like I said, is to become the first climate resilient nation. And the Caribbean has adopted the posture of becoming a resilient region. And so there has to be a comprehensive plan, and all of the countries in the region are focusing on such a plan. In Dominica's case, we refer to it as the National Resilience Strategy and an action plan, which outlines all of the projects, the programs that we would wish to implement. The challenge always is how it is to be financed. And the DRS, the Disaster Resilience Strategy, which we prepared along with assistance from the fund, deals with that portion. The DRS is built on 3 pillars: financial, structural, and disaster resilience. And what it does is to estimate the potential cost of the investments that must be made to build resilience and ensure that that fits into the overall macroeconomic framework. This is a good tool, we believe, that we could go to donors with and say, this is what we want to do, this is the strategy, this is the plan, this is how much it costs, and we hope to implement over a specific period of time. That way, we can then gauge what level of investments will give us what level of resilience and in what particular time. By the same vein, we have to continually assess what we do. And so the activity that Bruce referred to was extremely useful to us. It allowed us to look deeper into the transactions we had undertaken, pointed us to the areas where our legislation may need to be tweaked somewhat, where it may need to be changed, where there were gaps, and how best we could correct it. We're looking to the DRS to help us raise the additional financing that is required, because it sets out in a structured way the costs associated with the projects that are already been identified. Now, those projects are not selected at the top of our heads. Most of these come out of the initial assessment that was done after the hurricane, the post-disaster needs assessment, which was conducted along with the donor community. And so it's really just a full package of processes that need to come together to build resilience. The bottom line is that we want to ensure that once there is a disaster, as there is likely to be, that we minimize the loss of life and livelihoods, and there should be as minimal disruption as possible, and that the rebuilding process will take less time. For those who are familiar with the topography of Dominica, our roads tend to get blocked very easily. One of the things that we must focus on is how we build roads, as an example, so that the day after a storm, you are able to move around much more freely and begin the recovery process much faster. The same applies to telecommunication services. How do we install telecommunication services so that we're not struggling to send out messages of the help that we require and to be able to communicate freely? How do we do our banking transactions so that by the next day, the banks are able to open and to do business? That's what for us resilience be, our capacity to continue to function as close to normal as possible, preserving life, preserving livelihoods, and ensuring that the citizens of the region are better protected given the advent of that many storms. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Rosemary, for sharing that story and the things that Dominica sort of learned by going through those challenges. We're going to now turn to one of the IMF's valued partners and get their perspective. Richard Carter works for the United Kingdom's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and he's with us to speak about the UK government's Caribbean Disaster Resilience and Recovery Project, which finances the IMF's disaster resilience work stream at our Caribbean Regional Technical Assistance Center. So Richard, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Joe. So we are very proud in the UK to have been at the forefront of a number of the responses that were just identified by Rosamond following the devastating hurricanes in the region. And today I'm going to be briefly presenting on the UK's work on building resilience in a couple of areas. Just to mention at the global level, leading up to COP26, which is to be hosted by the UK, at the Caribbean regional level, looking at some of the specific work that we are doing in our Caribbean Development Assistance Program. And finally, I'm going to speak to a number of emerging issues for green resilient recovery, including COVID-19 considerations in our work. So the UK is presiding over COP26 in the upcoming year. And as a board member of the IMF and the World Bank, we are using our influence to mobilize support for a number of initiatives, including those to precipitate action around adaptation and resilience. And these include a call to action for resilience and adaptation, an £85 million risk-informed early action partnership, and £90 million towards the Global Risk Financing Facility, to which Jamaica has already applied for support. We are also supporting the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, and we are mobilizing the world-leading scientific expertise of the UK to help build resilience through programs such as the Commonwealth Marine Economies Program, which has worked with the World Meteorological Organization to develop products and tools for decision makers to help build resilience across the region. So first slide, regionally, resilience is at the pinnacle of the Caribbean development strategy of the UK. Our strategy focuses on the resilience and transformation of the region, supporting countries to withstand climate and economic shocks, and building societies that are more prosperous, inclusive, and safe. In our strategy, we seek to address the unique capability constraints facing the Caribbean, particularly in support of business environment improvements, promoting the application of good evidence and innovation, and dealing with the challenge of resilient development in the Caribbean. Second slide. Strengthening climate and disaster resilience has been a central aspect of our work for over a decade. And over 80% of the current Caribbean Development Program of the UK, totaling approximately £35 million a year, is devoted to building more resilient climate infrastructure, systems, and public assets to help withstand the effects of natural disasters and help the region recover faster from a catastrophic event. This portfolio includes resilient infrastructure, which you will see at the top there. And this is an almost £400 million portfolio, including our UK Caribbean Infrastructure Fund, our Smart Healthcare Facilities Program, which is looking to make healthcare facilities more resilient across the region, and our energy program supporting energy efficiency and renewable energy, including solar and geothermal. Secondly, resilient economies. And here we are basically looking to have a program of disaster resilience and recovery, the program that was mentioned earlier by Bruce, which we are supporting through our partners in the IMF, a program of support to improve public fiscal and financial systems for improved disaster protection through the Caribbean Technical Assistance Center, and supporting the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency with systems improvements, recovery guides, and surge support. And then thirdly, we are also supporting resilient economies through the development of shock responsive social protection systems and youth skills development that focus on emerging areas of employment, especially to progress the green economy among young people. So as you will see, this full sweep of programs that we are doing cover the broad challenge of building resilience in the region. On the final slide, I am going to take a look at some of the COVID-19 influenced possibilities for greening the recovery process. In an environment of uncertainty arising from the COVID-19 pandemic, green and inclusive approaches to recovery offer opportunities for sustainable growth. As COVID-19 recovery packages are designed and roll out, there's a strong opportunity to link them substantively to the planning and investment decision-making undertaken in national determined contributions and in the National Adaptation Plan processes. The Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office will provide funding through the multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank, to deliver technical assistance for recovery packages. The core objective is to support developing countries in their efforts to accelerate the transition to low carbon, inclusive, and resilient economies. And there are some silver linings coming out of the current pandemic. It has provided a glimpse of what a climate-induced catastrophe could look like and has moved the needle on discussions on disaster preparedness. It has demonstrated the effectiveness of science and data and model-driven and informed policy. It has promoted the importance of strengthening healthcare systems for delivery. It has precipitated funding for stronger social safety net systems. And it has provided greater emphasis on social hygiene and the importance of water, sanitation, and hygiene. And finally, it has highlighted that clear water and blue skies are possible. So our first response is on saving lives, on ensuring that key systems continue to function, on helping the most vulnerable through the provision of supplies, such as personal protection equipment. We are starting to work with our multilateral development partners to build and facilitate a green, resilient recovery by strengthening shock response systems, facilitating low carbon resilient development, and supporting a green infrastructure pipeline, supporting the post-COVID shift to look at climate and the healthcare nexus, and mobilizing clean finance and climate finance to jumpstart recovery through our example of the virtual roundtable on SIDS access to finance, which is actually going on as we speak. So the UK and the Caribbean have a strong partnership based on trust. We will continue to work together for shared security and prosperity to promote our shared values and interests globally. The UK stands ready to continue to support the Caribbean to increase resilience and ensure that they're better able to manage economic shocks, natural disasters, and the impacts of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's great to get that perspective. So hopefully these presentations have provided a broad picture of how the IMF and its partners are developing tools to help Caribbean countries and other small states vulnerable to natural disasters enhance their preparedness on a macroeconomic and other levels. We have a couple of questions. We don't have a lot of time, but we do have a couple of questions, and I think we can squeeze them both in. Why don't we go ahead and start with the first one? And I think that Sonia may be best positioned to answer this. So what are the next steps with the disaster resilience strategy at the IMF, and what resources are needed to help implement those next steps?
Thank you very much. This is a very good question. As I mentioned in my intervention, we have 2 pilot DRSs done for Dominica and Grenada, but then COVID came. So at the moment, the really first step is we are updating these 2 DRSs to input the impact of COVID there, but more on the future, on the steps. So what, as I mentioned in my presentation, and also Rosamund said, this is a country-owned document. So the IMF and the World Bank is supporting them by putting all our techniques in order to do it. So what we will need as a next step is that the revised version of the DRS is fully absorbed in the policy making of the country. So Rosamund can explain this better, but it already was part of the government plan, but now the revised will be there. And then the next step is to make this DRS public. And we were thinking in having a Caribbean forum on something that we can put together all the players. Because one of the advantages of these DRSs is that it not only provides the costing of investments, but also puts the sequencing and the prioritization of all the resilience projects. And this will help clearly identify the needs from the international donors. Just linking to the second question, there is a lot of financing that is needed because building resilience is not cheap. It's, I mean, by some degree, 25% more expensive than any other infrastructure, for instance, in the first pillar. So we need to put all the stakeholders together, and what we are trying to do when the 2 DRs are finalized, so that we can discuss with international donors the gap that is needed to be filled, and go with a comprehensive plan in order to fill in this gap. And with that, I'm including climate funds, which are also part of the stakeholders that we can help. From the IMF, as we have been mentioning, we are exploring innovative ideas in order to help to catalyze more funds to this. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we might have time for one more question. And I think that perhaps anyone can answer, but maybe Richard or Rosamund would be well positioned to answer. But question is, how do donors know these projects are high quality or of critical importance, and not just a wish list from the countries? Have these projects gone through any sort of appraisal or prioritization by the countries themselves or by development partners like the World Bank?
Yeah, perhaps I'll start, and I'm sure Rosamund will be able to pitch in. First of all, we essentially respond to the development needs of the countries. So essentially, we are in support of where the country wants to go, and we can't go farther or faster than the countries themselves want to go as a donor. The second thing is that there is quite a lot of evidence that is emerging now to drive policymaking. And the UK has been, like many of the other development partners, ensuring that we follow the evidence in terms of what works, what has been demonstrated to work, and what the evidence is showing in terms of our responses. And therefore, whereas we sometimes get presented with huge wish lists, there is a process of prioritization as we go along, because the countries themselves cannot do everything. Things have to be properly sequenced. And we use the evidence and the science to help guide our interventions in that regard.
So I'll add, that in fact, the portfolio of projects starts, or at least in Dominica's case, started after the passage of the storm and the PDNA was done. So it is clear what projects are required. The projects form part of the strategy, which was completed by a consultative process, including donors. And those projects must go through the budgetary process. So it's presented to the Parliament as well. And so it's not a matter of selecting a project that somebody simply thinks of. There is a process that they must go through, and they must meet the standard and the requirements of the donors in any case. So it's subject to all of the EIAs and everything else that is required. So there is a process.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on that? Okay. Well, we have hit the 12:45 mark, which is when we are scheduled to stop. So I think that's all the time we have today. I wanted to thank the speakers for their time in these really great presentations, and everybody who has tuned in to watch the presentations, and for the folks who submitted some excellent questions. Please note that the capacity development talks from the 2020 annual meetings, can all be watched and shared later by visiting IMF Connect. There will be links where you can share these recorded talks on social media or with anybody you think might be interested in watching them. We have a couple more talks this week. The next talk will be on collaboration with Colombia as it adjusts macroeconomic frameworks to assess the impact of COVID-19. And it starts at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow, October 21st. So I think that is it for this talk. I want to thank everybody again, and we look forward to hearing anything anybody might have to say after the fact. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thanks so much, and have a good rest of the day.